Hey guys, it's Elena. Welcome back to my channel. So I am 28 weeks pregnant and am also in need of making a dress for a wedding that I'm going to. So I decided to self-draft a dress that would also fit a growing belly, but is also versatile so that I can wear it when I'm not pregnant. So it's kind of a win-win. So I'm going to show you all the steps that I went through so that you can self-draft a dress for yourself that will fit you at any stage of your life and also get a beautiful dress out of it. All right, so like I said before, I am self-drafting this dress. And there are about 8-ish steps that I'm gonna go through to do this, right? So I'm gonna make a pre-garment, fit it, mark it and cut it, create an actual mock-up, make any adjustments, pick it apart, use those pieces to cut out the real fabric, and then put together the real garment. So basically, I have taken just a general pattern piece that I've used in the past a bunch of times, cut that out of some fabric that I don't really care about. I found a flat sheet from the thrift store, so that's what this nice seashell-y fabric is. And I am just basically putting it together like I normally would, right? So I'm putting 2 darts in the front, and then I am also doing 2 darts in the back as well. So I'm basically just marking where I want those darts to go and am sewing up those darts like I normally would if this was my real fabric and I was sewing with this actual pattern. So here I have my finished front piece and then my finished back pieces. So I have 1 front piece and then 2 back pieces, a left and right, that each have a dart in it. So I'm just gonna put this all together like I would for a normal bodice. So I am pinning along the shoulder seams and the side seams, and then I'm just going to sew along where I pinned it so that I can try it on. So that basically completes step number 1, and we're going to move on to actually fitting it to yourself. So I want to have a really nice form-fitting dress that's about an empire waist. So I'm just taking this garment that I have put together, this bodice, and I'm putting it on myself since I don't have a mannequin that fits me, and I am making any adjustments that I need to make. And I sewed that together and ended up adding a dart. And so now I'm going to move on to the next step, which is marking and cutting. So I started with 1 big front piece with 2 darts, but I want to turn this into a bodice with princess seams. So I'm just basically marking with a Sharpie or a pen where I want my new seams to be, and then I'm just cutting it where I want my seams to be. So basically I'm turning a pattern that has darts in it to a pattern with no darts. It just has curved panels instead. So the next step is to create the actual mock-up with those pieces that I just cut out. So I have my fabric, I am putting my pieces that I just cut onto it, and the reason why I'm doing this is so that I can add seam allowance, because these are the pieces that ideally I'm going to be using to cut out the real fabric. So I'm just adding about a 1/2 inch all the way around all of my pattern pieces and marking it with a Sharpie. Again, if you're doing this on carpet, please be careful. You don't want Sharpie on your carpet, that would be horrible. So I am marking, adding seam allowance, and then cutting it out. And then I'm just putting it together how it would go. So for a princess seam bodice, I am pinning and sewing together 2 side panels for the front, and then each back has 2 panels as well. Once I've done that, I'm just gonna put it on, make any adjustments, because this is the final thing before we go into the next step, which is picking it apart, which, you know, common sense, but we're gonna pick these pieces apart so that we can use these exact pieces to cut out our real fabric. So this is where I'm left now. I have a bodice front panel and bodice front side panels, and then bodice back panel and bodice side back panel. So I'm using these to cut out my real fabric. I've already added seam allowance to this, so I can just, you know, cut out matching these pieces of fabric. And I'm also at this point cutting out the sleeves, the pocket, any facing, and also the skirt pieces. So this is all the fabric that I've cut out. The stripe is the backing of the fabric. And then you can move on to the final step of self-drafting, which is to put together the real garment. And this is kind of where, I mean, you're kind of just finally starting the real deal, right? So I am taking my front center bodice piece and matching up the side panels for this front bodice piece. So I'm just basically lining up the bottom of each piece and then pinning it together. And this is my attempt of trying to show you what that looks like all pinned. So you can see that there's a nice curve to it. This pattern is jacquard, which is wonderful because it holds structure really well. So I think that's a great fit for this princess seam. So when you are sewing up these side seams, it can be a little bit tricky because it is a curve and can be such a steep curve. So in this case, just go really slow. I find that curving the fabric and like kind of pitching it can help, but this is kind of what you're going to be left with, and it looks really smooth. I definitely suggest holding it up to yourself at this point and just make sure that, like, you know, preliminarily it fits. And then at this point I am serging off those raw edges just because I am not going to want to do it later on with these front pieces. So definitely do it at this point. And then you can move on to the next piece, which is putting together the back pieces of your bodice to the front piece. Just, you know, similar like we did in the beginning with the mock-up. So I am pinning together at the shoulder seams and the side seams and preparing to sew this whole entire bodice finally together. So I've got 2 shoulder seams and 2 side seams that I'm sewing together at this point. So at this point, I tried on this bodice and wasn't super happy with the fit, even though I did, you know, try it and test it out a couple times. There's always still going to be adjustments. So this process is really slow, but if you want something that's going to fit you really well, it is really important to take your time. And if you don't like it, it's okay. Just go pick it out and make any adjustments that you need. So I am taking off about a 1/2 inch on all of my raw edges, so at the sides and also at the shoulder seams. So I picked that out, trimmed it, and I went ahead and sewed it back together. And I'm moving on to the sleeves. So I wanted these sleeves to be kind of puffy, not overly puffy, but a little bit. So I did a gathering stitch all along the top of my sleeve, and I'm just pulling on that basting stitch to make it into one nice gather. I'm folding my sleeve in half, and I am sewing along that seam, which is going to go basically under your bicep. At this point, I am also serging it so that I can attach it to the bodice. So this part, you can get really good and make it look great. So take your time and nest those seams. Make sure that they are fitting really nicely together. at that bottom, and then I usually flip the garment over and then just work my way, pinning all the way around, and then I'm just bringing it over to my sewing machine so that I can actually attach it. I do suggest doing one sleeve at a time and then putting it on, again, just to make sure that you don't want to make any adjustments. But look how nice that seam looks. It matches up perfectly. So the next portion of my bodice is making the facing. So I did self-draft this pattern. You saw the whole process. So I am needing to make a facing so that I can have a finished and very nice looking neck edge. So I'm basically just cutting out a rectangle that will fit the entire curve. So I'm doing a front piece and then 2 back pieces. So this is my front, it's folded in half. I'm pinning this rectangle to my actual bodice and then flipping it over so that I can basically cut out that curved neck piece. I'm taking out the pins and then I'm just going to trim off the excess of that rectangle to turn it into like a half moon semicircle type shape. I did the same exact thing for the back pieces, and so now I can just put the whole facing together. So I have the left back piece, the right back piece, and then one big center piece. Sew those together at those shoulder pieces. You will want to serge it at this point because the next step is to attach the facing to your bodice. So again, like we did with the sleeves, you're going to nest those seams at the shoulders. So I'm pinning both shoulders first and then going and easing the rest of that fabric all along. And I did leave quite a bit of extra at the tails just so that I could make sure that it would fit. And then I'm doing a really small 1/4 inch seam allowance to attach this facing to that neck all the way around the bodice neck. At this point, I'm also serging the neck edge. This may be unnecessary for you depending on what kind of fabric you have, but this fabric frays a ton. So I'm making sure to serge everything, and I'm also serging that like raw flap edge of that facing as well. Again, just so it doesn't fray or anything when I'm wearing it. And then I'm taking it over to my iron, and this part's actually really important. I am folding the facing up, but I'm making sure that my seam allowance is facing up towards my facing. And the reason why we're going to do that is because we're going to understitch. So I'm taking my seam allowance, folding it towards the facing, and we're going to sew along there. And the reason we're going to do this is because I'm trying to avoid doing a visible top stitch along my neckline to keep it staying down and nice and curved. So I'm doing an understitch. So I have a very, very small seam allowance here. I'm doing it right next to the seam, but I'm just sewing along on this facing and attaching the seam allowance to the facing. And this is what that looks like. It looks so good. It's a very small thing, but it actually makes a huge difference when going to fold down your facing. And then when you go to iron it, it actually sits down nice and flat, and ironing just, it makes it really nice and crisp and look perfect. So the next thing I am moving on to is finishing off finally the sleeves. So like I said before, I really wanted to do a nice cute little puff sleeve. I didn't go overboard with it, but I did want to do a little puff sleeve. So I decided to put some elastic on the end of my sleeve to make it kind of puffy, bring it in a little bit, since this fabric is really stiff. So I'm just doing a double folded hem to make a casing all the way around the edge of my sleeve. So I folded it up about a 1/2 inch twice, And then I'm just sewing along the edge to attach that hem or casing. And I'm just making sure that at the very bottom, I'm leaving about an inch gap so that I have room to insert the elastic. So here you can see I've left out a little tiny gap, and that's just enough room for me to insert my elastic. So to do this, I have my elastic, I've measured it to my biceps so that it's nice and comfortable. I have a safety pin on actually both ends. So one end safety pinned to the dress just to make sure it doesn't get sucked in. And then the other safety pin just helps me have something to grip to pass it through that casing. So you're going to feed it through all the way around until it comes out the other end of that little gap that we left for ourselves. And you can kind of pull it out so it's easier for you to attach, but you're basically just going to overlap the ends a little bit, pin it, and then sew it together with a zigzag. Not that you would know because my hand is covering this entire clip, but you're going to do a zigzag stitch to attach this elastic to itself. It's a little bit tricky to get in there, but just pull it really tight, and this is what you'll be left with, which is a really nice, cute little sleeve. And then you can just go ahead and finish off the closing of the opening that we made earlier, and then you have a nice puff sleeve. I thought that this looked perfect and was a perfect fit for this dress. And we can finally move on to the skirt. Also, I just like to point out, can we all take a moment to appreciate how shiny my hair is in this bun? I mean, like, I'm totally blocking the shot. You can't really even see it all what I'm doing, but my hair looks great. Thank you, pregnancy hormones, for at least one good thing. So I'm basically just cutting out 2 giant rectangles because I am going to be making pleats, box pleats specifically. So I got my fabric, measured it out, and figured out how many pleats that I wanted and how big I wanted those pleats. So I'm taking the center of my fabric. I am measuring the width of my center pleat with pins. And then I'm measuring over the entire distance that's going to need to be folded in. So if my pleat was 2.5 inches, the next part I'm going to pin is about 5 inches. I'm taking one pin, just eyeballing it to the center of the folded area, taking the beginning of the next pleat and having it touch the other beginning of the next pleat. So basically the 5 inches that I'm taking in that's being folded is kind of split between both pleats. And you're basically just going to continue doing this many times for the front panel and the back panels as well. So you're going to measure out your pleat distance, measure out the folded distance, measure out the pleat distance, the folded distance, and then you're going to basically bring the beginning and end of the pleats into each other, folding that folded chunk in and smashing it flat. And that's how you're going to get box pleats, which is what we have here. And again, I am working with a quite stiff fabric, so it was really important that I iron these pleats and get them nice and steamed. So this is what they look like from the back. And then from the front, here it is. I'm really happy actually with what they turned out to be. So to start attaching these, I am basically coming down about an inch from the raw edge and sewing a basting stitch just all the way across my pleats. And this is going to help me in the future when I go to attach my skirt to my dress. Also, Like I said, I'm going to emphasize again, use a basting stitch because a stitch is going to be coming out. So once you've gone all the way across the length of your fabric with the basting stitch, you're going to just sew a normal stitch along the very top of your fabric with a normal stitch length so that it's nice and attached. And this is what it looks like. And the reason why this is so helpful is because we have a nice little runway to attach our skirt to our bodice. But before we do that, we're gonna put in the beloved pockets. So I am measuring down 5 to 7 inches. This will depend on where your waist starts. This is an empire waist for me, so I wanted it to come down just a little bit. And then I'm sewing my pocket piece right sides together to my skirt panel. And you're going to do this for all of your pocket pieces and skirt panels. So for your front panel, you're going to have 2 pocket pieces, and then 1 pocket piece for the left back panel and 1 pocket piece for the right back panel. And once you've attached all of the pockets to the skirts pieces, you're going to attach the skirt front to the skirt back pieces. So I find it's best to just line it all up, pin at the corners first, and then make the rest fit. And then you're just going to use your normal seam allowance to sew all the way down. Make sure to pivot at those corners where the pocket starts and ends, and that will get you a really nice crisp looking pocket from the outside. At this point, I can finally attach the skirt to my bodice. So I am matching up the side seams with where the pockets are first, and then going and pinning just the rest of the bodice to the skirt. And then I'm just sewing along there with my normal seam allowance. Again, it really helped that we did those 2 seams before, so that when we go to sew this together, none of our pleats are gonna like open up or fold or anything, but we are left with this basting stitch that's visible from the front. So go to make sure that you pick that out. This was a little bit tricky with the type of fabric that I had, so hopefully it's a little bit easier for you. But once you have completed that step, I am serging it. You can finish off your raw edges any way you like, but serging is just the easiest, most efficient way for me that I think still looks pretty good. So once that part is done, I can finally go put in my zipper. I am using an invisible zipper, and I do have a video, conveniently for you, where I go into more depth on a tutorial of how to install invisible zippers. So go check that out if you need a little bit more help, and then you can move on to one of the final steps, which is hemming the dress. So I decided to fold my fabric up, I think about 3/4 of an inch, and then I folded mine up again, so it's a double folded hem. I find that that's just the easiest for me, but it still looks very nice and professional. So I folded it up twice, made sure to give it a really good iron, pinned it plenty, and then I sewed along there with a really small seam allowance so that it would look really nice and crisp when I am wearing it. The final step, which is wonderful, is to finish off that janky facing around the neck. So we have just been kind of flapping around. So basically I am folding down the facing right sides together, pinning along the zipper, trimming any excess fabric, and then I'm just sewing along the outside of that zipper. And the reason why we're doing this is so that when we go to flip out that facing and flip the zipper out, it's going to look nice and finished, and the zipper is enclosed between the facing and the outside of our fabric. So it just really makes it look very professional. There's nothing flapping around, so that everyone can enjoy the beautiful dress that you've just created. And let me tell you, I'm so happy with how this turned out. It ended up fitting my bump perfectly. I love the style of it. I love the fabric, which I did get on discount, by the way. And it was perfect for the wedding that I went to. And I think it looked really great with my husband's nice tuxedo as well. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think, and I will see you next time.